Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us for episode 704 of the People Behind the Science podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Marie McNeely, and in this episode, I am excited to share our conversation with Dr. Tessa Hill, first released on May 1st of 2017. In her research, Tessa answers broad questions related to how climate change impacts ocean ecosystems in the past, present, and future. Her work examines changes in temperature, ocean acidification, ocean productivity, and calcification. And in addition, Tessa and her team are dedicated to science communication and public engagement surrounding their research and related policy. And in our conversation, Tessa shares some fantastic stories from her life in science. So get ready for this episode of People Behind the Science.
Every day, discoveries are made that will change our understanding of the world around us. Dr. Marie McNeely is here to bring you the brilliant minds who are making these discoveries so they can share their incredible stories and take you on an amazing journey. Welcome to People Behind the Science.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of People Behind the Science. I am thrilled to introduce you all today to Dr. Tessa Hill. So, Tessa, thanks so much for joining us on the show. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, we are excited to have you here today and to learn more about you and your work. But before we dive into all the details, Tessa, I do want to share a little bit of your background with our listeners. So listeners, Tessa is an associate professor in the Department of Earth and Planetary Sciences at the University of California, Davis. She is part of the Bodega Ocean Acidification Research group there at the Bodega Marine Laboratory. And Tessa received her bachelor's in marine science from Eckerd College and her Ph.D. in marine science from the University of California, Santa Barbara. Next, Tessa was awarded a University of California President's Postdoctoral Fellowship at UC Davis before joining the faculty there. And listeners, Tessa has received many awards and honors during her career, including the Presidential Early Career Award for Scientists and Engineers, as well as an NSF CAREER Award. She is also a fellow of the California Academy of Sciences, an American Association for the Advancement of Science Leshner Public Engagement Fellow, and also a panelist on the West Coast Ocean Acidification and Hypoxia panel. And Tessa is here with us today, listeners, to talk about her life in science. So Tessa, we want to know it all. Can you start by telling us how you spend your time when you're not busy doing science?
I probably spend my time just like lots of other people do. My husband and I have two lovely young children, and so I spend a lot of time with my family, and those lovely children are growing up too fast, so mostly I just try to freeze time and take it all in each day, each amazing thing that they are doing. But we do a lot of gardening and skiing and hiking and camping and vacationing together, and I'm a runner. I'm a distance runner, and so I run half marathons and marathons. And actually, I come up with a lot of really great scientific ideas while I'm running. So sometimes my life outside of science and my life in science overlap.
Absolutely. I think sometimes you get your best ideas when you're escaping the madness of the laboratory and can kind of clear your head in nature.
That's so true.
So now you mentioned you have children. How old are they?
They are 7 and 10.
Oh, wonderful. So are they getting into running as well?
Yes, actually, my 10-year-old runs with me pretty regularly, and the 7-year-old is starting to get interested in that.
Gotcha. Well, fantastic to hear more about your life outside of science and how they overlap sometimes. But I do want to chat a little bit about your scientific side next. So can you tell us how you describe what you do to someone who might not at all have any familiarity with your field?
Sure. I study the ocean, and in particular, I study how climate change is impacting environments in the ocean in the past, in the present, and in the future.
Excellent. That's a wonderful summary.
It was short.
I'm always impressed. Most people have this like 5-minute tirade. That was like short, sweet, and beautiful. Well, Tessa, I'm looking forward to chat more about your work as we go through our program today. But I want to take a moment to talk about motivation first. I think as a scientist, there can be a lot to pack into a day, especially when you're balancing family life and all these outdoor activities that you like to do as well. So is there something in particular that keeps you motivated, or do you have a favorite quote or saying you could share?
I think fundamentally I'm motivated because I'm curious. And so what gets me coming into work every day is the vast number of questions that I have about how the ocean works. But I do have some favorite quotes, and I actually had a hard time thinking of just one. So I have two that I like to share. And the first is from Albert Einstein. And he said, "The right to search for truth implies also a duty. One must not conceal any part of what one has recognized to be true." And I think that particularly resonates with me as someone who studies climate change, that it's really my responsibility to tell the world about what I'm finding in the ocean. And so I think about Einstein quite a bit in terms of the things that he learned and knew and felt a moral obligation to tell other people about. And then my second quote that I thought about is from Rachel Carson, who is an amazing woman in science to look back at, and her story has really been always very inspirational to me. And she said, "Those who contemplate the beauty of the earth find reserves of strength that will endure as long as life lasts." And that resonates with me because I think as a scientist, and particularly as a climate scientist, we do need reserves of strength because it's not always easy.
Definitely. Well, I love both of these quotes, Tessa. And I think you mentioned two really iconic figures here in Einstein and Rachel Carson. I think these people can be really inspirational, maybe when you're starting your career as you go through these different stages of your career as a scientist. So were they an inspiration for you, or were there others that really had a big impact on you?
Rachel Carson definitely was. I read her books as a high schooler, I believe, initially, and then again. And actually, I continue to read them. I assign Silent Spring to my undergraduate class, and so I reread it and continue to draw inspiration from that. Similarly, Sylvia Earle would be another woman in science, an oceanographer, who provided quite a bit of inspiration to me. But I also think there's many people along the way who provided inspiration and mentoring and role models for me. And I actually think that has a lot to do with me being a scientist, is that I had many people encouraging me along the way, most notably my undergraduate research mentor, Greg Brooks, and my graduate research mentor, James Kennett. They have been lasting influences on my life and really great role models about pursuing a scientific career motivated by curiosity about the world around us.
I love it. So can you tell us where this curiosity of yours began? Was there a moment that you can remember where this spark and passion for science ignited?
It's a funny question, actually, because I think that children are born that way, and I absolutely see that in my own kids. Children are sort of natural scientists. They're very curious, inquisitive, asking questions about the world around them all the time, and I don't think I was any different. I did have the advantage of growing up on Puget Sound, south of Seattle, in Tacoma, Washington. And I spent a lot of time sitting on the water and looking at rocks and looking at shells and asking questions about the water. And I had a family that really encouraged my curiosity about that natural world and the ocean. And so I moved from Washington State to go to college at a small liberal arts college in Florida called Eckerd College in St. Petersburg. And I majored in marine science there. But perhaps more importantly than that, I was very lucky in that I had a lot of opportunities presented to me while I was there, including getting to work with professors in their labs and on their research. And I really feel like I got to see what science is like, including the ups and downs and the good days and the bad days, and what it felt like to get up and ask questions for a living. And I really felt like that's what I want to do. I want to ask questions for a living. And I also got to do my own research project while I was there when I was a senior. I did that looking at how the environment of South Florida had changed through time, and I used teeny tiny fossils that were in sediments, that I was able to count the fossils and look at how these fossils had changed through time. And in doing that, I sort of had my eyes open to this whole world of reconstructing what happened in the past, in past environments and past climates. And so that's what I decided to pursue in graduate school.
Fantastic. Well, it sounds like you had this wonderful opportunity to work as an undergraduate on a research project, and the big picture sounds wonderful. And I think some of us, though, can get frustrated or stressed out maybe by the tedium. And it sounds like this type of project where you're counting tiny fossils may have an element of that.
Oh, yes. I would say through my career, I have had the fortune of spending a lot of time on the ocean, and I also have probably spent more time actually in the lab sitting at a microscope doing very tedious work. But it's that tedious work that answers those big questions, right? So it's worth it.
Definitely. And for me, some of these maybe more mundane sounding repetitive tasks, it's almost therapeutic because your mind can wander to some of the bigger questions that you're thinking about.
Absolutely.
It's not so bad.
Yeah. It's funny because now Today, as a professor, I don't actually have that many opportunities where I get to sit at the microscope and look at tiny fossils. And my students laugh at me because when I get to do that, I'm actually very excited about it. So that just gives you perspective on the fact that you look back and you wish that you had more of that.
Right. You have to appreciate these things in the moment more.
You do.
So now you started talking about how you went off to graduate school next. Can you talk us through those stages of your career and how you made the decisions that you made that got you to where you are today?
Yeah, so I sort of fell in love with these microfossils. I was pretty hooked at that point, and so I moved to UC Santa Barbara to pursue my dissertation with Jim Kennett, who I mentioned earlier. And during my graduate work, I looked at the role of natural methane seepage out of the ocean, so methane sort of bubbling up out of the seafloor, and why that might be important both to the environment of the deep sea, the seafloor, but also because some of that methane might make it up to the atmosphere. And to pursue that, I spent a lot of time out on boats collecting samples. But really, when I look back on graduate school, the reality is I spent most of my time sitting at a microscope, finding these tiny fossils and counting them, but also looking at the chemical fingerprints that were held within them. So I looked at things like carbon and oxygen isotopes of these tiny shells. And when I finished that work, I moved to UC Davis, as you mentioned, first as a postdoctoral researcher, and then was later, 2 years later, hired as a faculty member here at UC Davis. And I actually still do a lot of very similar work. I'm still very interested in understanding past climate and past environments using those tiny fossils. But I now have 1 foot solidly in the modern ocean. So I'm lucky in that my research has been sort of influenced by my nearest neighbors. I'm at a marine lab, Bodega Marine Lab. I have these amazing collaborations with ecologists who are interested in how climate change is impacting marine environments today. So I now spend a lot of time thinking about modern climate change and chemical change in the ocean acidification, how it's impacting our coast, and also reconstructing events like that in the past and sort of asking the record of the past, what can we learn from the past that tells us about what might happen in the future? And so I'm really lucky now in that I get to work on these big questions that sort of move back and forth between past and present and future. And I get to collaborate with really amazing people who teach me a lot about the modern ocean.
Very cool. And you mentioned you track these chemical signatures and microfossils to be able to reconstruct what happened in the past. And I'm sort of intrigued by these microfossils. What sort of organisms were these?
Sure. So for most of the work that I have done and my students and I have done together, these have been foraminifera, which are a tiny shelled protist. So just imagine an amoeba that has a shell, and they're usually about the size of a grain of sand. And they're amazing. They're found everywhere in the ocean. There are tens of thousands of species of them. We learned so much from studying how they change through time. So we can reconstruct things like, did the temperature of the oceans warm, or did the amount of oxygen in the oceans change, or did the sea level change, all from these teeny tiny fossils.
Very interesting. So are there similar organisms alive today?
Yes, absolutely. They are out there today. I could go collect some in the ocean right in front of my office.
Oh, wow. That's awesome.
Yeah, so they span much of the fossil record, but they are living in the ocean today. And in fact, some of the work I do with my students is that we go collect living ones out in the ocean and we raise them in the lab. And we raise them under different conditions in the lab and we watch what they do. So then we actually can, like I said, we can look either towards the future or to the past by doing those experiments, because we could raise them in the lab under warmer or higher carbon dioxide conditions. And that tells us what might happen to them in the future. And it also allows us to identify climate change events in the past, because we can look at sort of how their shells change or their shape changes or the chemistry of their shells change. And it refines how we might interpret those past records.
Well, this is fascinating. It's great to hear more about your work. And I know you have a lot of different projects going on in the laboratory right now. Is there one, Tessa, right now that is just your absolute favorite that you want to tell us a little bit more detail about?
That is an impossible question for me to answer. Mm-hmm. I do not have an absolute favorite. There's a lot of things going on in my research group right now, and they're all really fun and really interesting. But I'll highlight one that I'm excited about, which is that we do a lot of work on modern climate change and ocean acidification, which is a chemical change that's happening in the ocean because of our carbon dioxide emissions. So as we put carbon dioxide into the atmosphere through driving our cars or other industrial activities, about 30% of that carbon dioxide goes straight into the ocean. The ocean just soaks it up from the atmosphere. And it's changing the chemistry of the ocean. And a lot of what our research group has done is document what those changes might mean. But one of the things we're working on right now with the state of California is whether there are special coastal habitats, things like seagrasses or kelp forests or salt marshes. All of these things have plants or plant-like materials in them, which means they're using photosynthesis. So they're actually taking carbon out of the water or out of the air. And that carbon dioxide ends up sort of locked up in the parts of the plant, the blades of the seagrass or the roots of the seagrass. Mm-hmm. And one of the questions we're asking now is, could these special habitats sort of help us in our ability to mitigate the problems of climate change and ocean acidification? And if so, would that be a reason to sort of set aside big parts of the coast for these special habitats or conserve or restore the ones that we have?
Very cool. Now, does a lot of your research focus here in the U.S. on the West Coast environment, or is it maybe more generalizable to other places, or do you sample globally?
At this point, I do almost all of my work is along the west coast of the U.S. I think a lot of what we learn in these big oceanographic systems actually is generalizable to other places. So many of the things that we're learning along the California coast or more broadly the west coast of the U.S. can definitely be applied elsewhere. And in the past, I have done plenty of work in other places in the Gulf of Mexico and in the far North Atlantic, for example. So I'm certainly not opposed to working any place where that curiosity takes me.
Definitely. Science, I think, takes you where you need to go, which is great.
That's right.
Now, I know you have a lot of really interesting collaborations and sort of outreach projects going on in terms of working with science teachers and also with some industry experts. So can you tell us a little bit about how you integrate your laboratory with these kinds of people?
That's one of the most exciting and interesting aspects of my job at this point. So with K through 12 teachers, I'm working with a group at my university, the Math and Science Teaching Program, that encourages science students to consider a career in K through 12 teaching. So I have been working with students in this program. So these are students that are thinking about going into K-12 teaching, and we're encouraging them to do that if that is their passion. And I've been working with these students to develop curriculum that we can use in middle school and high school settings around climate change. And my goal in that is to deliver very evidence-based, data-based activities that can be done in middle schools and high schools that are fun and interesting and sort of question-driven, but they're not based on anecdotes. They're based on real data that we are collecting, either in my lab or in labs of my colleagues or data that has been made publicly available. And this is really exciting to me. I get to work with these great students who are considering dedicating their lives to educating middle and high schoolers. And we get to sit around and talk and think and work on how you would talk about climate change in a sixth grade classroom, for example. And we've developed a bunch of curriculum modules together. I think we have about 12 to 15 different assignments or activities that you would do in classes. And by next year, I think we will be uploading all of them to a public database so that any teacher could use them. They just have to get through sort of our testing and revision phase before we go there.
That is phenomenal.
That's been really rewarding for me. And it's actually not, I think people think that these things are going to take a tremendous amount of their personal time. And the amazing thing about working with students and with an established program that really has provided a lot of support for this is that mostly what I'm providing is my expertise. I can sit down with these students and tell them about data sets or things that might be interesting to cover in classrooms. And the students are actually doing a lot of the creative work on how to translate this to a sixth grader or an eighth grader. I think in general, the thing I would say about doing work like this is that you might be surprised that it's quite fulfilling and not as hard as you think it is going to be.
Right.
And I would say the same. You brought up my industry academic partnerships, again, is something that I'm really proud of and has been surprisingly impactful for me as a scientist. About 5 years ago, I was approached by the owners of an oyster company, Hog Island Oyster Company, on the California coast, and they are concerned about the impacts of ocean acidification on oysters and other aquaculture species. That means shellfish that are being raised like a farm. So these are farmers in the ocean, right?
Sure.
So we started talking together and working together and thinking about things that would help us answer really fundamental, exciting scientific questions for our research group, and also overlap with things that they were dying to know in order to sort of make plans and adapt their business around this problem. And boy, it has been really successful. We have a monitoring station that we work on together that tracks the temperature and the salinity of the water and the carbon dioxide in the water in one of the local bays here in California, in Tamales Bay. And we've kept that monitoring station. It's like a weather station, but for ocean. And we've kept it going for 4 years so far, thanks to some federal support from NOAA. The National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration is now funding that project. But we also have spent a lot of time just thinking and talking about what it will mean to try to eat sustainably from the ocean in 50 years as these problems continue. And what can we do? What kinds of questions can we ask scientifically that might, again, tell us really basic fundamental things about this problem, but also tell the oyster farmers what things can they do to ensure the success of their business for decades to come. And it's a great collaboration where we're sort of all trying to be forward-thinking and innovative and ask interesting questions that are of mutual interest.
Absolutely. And this is really intriguing to me because I think you hear about this almost extension type work a lot where scientists are working directly with farmers in the world of agriculture. But this is sort of the first time I've run across it in the marine sciences world. So do you know, are there any other, I guess, maybe more formalized types of position that have this type of extension component to it in your field, or is it moving in that direction?
It's a great question because you're absolutely true. And I'm actually at a school where that's a deeply rooted part of our history is the agricultural extension part. And my colleagues have been very supportive of this idea, and I think it's in part because I'm at an institution that really believes that science can be rooted in society and big questions that we can answer, but that also are helping people. So I'm lucky to be at an institution that encourages people to do that kind of work. Mm-hmm. But I have to say, we modeled that partnership after some existing partnerships. So we didn't come up with that ourselves. We actually heard of people doing it elsewhere on the West Coast, notably Whiskey Creek Oyster Hatchery in Oregon, and scientists from Oregon State University have much the same partnership. And we sort of heard how fulfilling this was for them, and we modeled our work after theirs. But I think there would be overall benefits to science for people to think broadly about how their work fits into the world. And I think I've been very, very lucky in that I get to work sort of at this sweet spot, an interface where I get to ask really fundamental, basic scientific questions. And oftentimes, those are also really societally relevant. And I don't think that all scientists get to work at that interface, but I would encourage people to think about whether that interface could exist for them. And again, it may be easier than you at first think it will be.
Definitely. Well, I think we've talked about a lot of the great aspects of your research, some of the wonderful projects that you're able to work on. But I think it's not all sunshine and roses in science all the time, unfortunately.
That's true.
Absolutely. I love sharing some of the stories of struggles and challenges because I think it is so important to give people out there a realistic picture of what life is like as a scientist and what the career path entails. And there are these bumps in the road sometimes. So do you have a story, Tessa, of your own that you can share of a failure or a challenge or a struggle that you had and how you worked through it to continue on to be a successful scientist?
I actually think failure is a part of almost everyday life as a scientist, and you actually start to get used to that, believe it or not. Mm-hmm. We operate in a system where we are questioning and we question ourselves and we question each other, and we put each other through a very rigorous peer review system for everything that we do that involves a lot of sort of self-correction and community correction. And so receiving criticism or even rejection becomes a very regular part of your scientific life. And so I think one of the things we do as scientists is that we develop a lot of tools to deal with that. And we also develop a little bit of immunity to it. That is there will be many, many failures before there is a big success. Just an example of that is that we generate research ideas all the time. I'm constantly coming up with cool things that I think are the most amazing thing ever, and I write them into a proposal to a federal funding agency to try to fund my work. And many of these agencies, you get funded 10 to 15% of the time of the ideas that you submit.
Right.
And so what that means is that actually 90% of the time, people are saying to you, this idea actually isn't quite there yet, and you need to go back to the drawing board and work harder. So my first thought on that question is it's hard for me to pick out one event because I actually think it's a pretty normal and natural part of the scientific process that there's a lot of self-correction.
It's a steady stream of criticism.
Yeah. I'm trying to not be too negative about that, but it's true. One thing that came to mind as I was talking about this is that part of getting used to that feeling of failure or rejection is that many scientists then struggle from what we call imposter syndrome, which is the sense that you've made it this far, but someone might discover at any moment that you really don't deserve to be where you are. Maybe you aren't as great as they thought you were, or you aren't as smart as they thought you were. And you suffer from this fear of being sort of found out, that maybe you don't belong in the position that you're in. And for me, I found the best way to counter those feelings is to actually say those crazy feelings out loud to some group of very supportive people. And so I'm lucky that I have close colleagues and friends who I can call up and say, well, this is where I'm at. These are these feelings that the rejection or the failure has sort of built up in my own head. And they remind me of the good things that have happened or why I should keep pushing forward and generating new ideas and new questions and why it's worth it to keep taking those risks.
I love that. I think having that support system is so important because you're absolutely right. I think there's no way to escape the fact that you're always going to almost have that feeling of, I don't know all the things I feel like I should know. I don't know how to do everything I feel like I need to do to be successful in that position.
Absolutely. And I think it's pretty pervasive. And I think the thing that we do to work against ourselves is to actually not articulate that that is sometimes how science feels. So I'm trying to be better at articulating that. I think we have all felt that. And so then if one of my students is feeling that way or one of my colleagues is feeling that way, they know they can come to me and say, okay, now I'm in this space. I need you to talk me
off the ledge. Yeah.
Talk me off this imposter feeling ledge. Exactly.
So how do you go about developing this support system? Because I think it might be scary for young faculty members or postdocs or maybe even graduate students to approach someone and say, this is how I'm feeling right now. Can we talk about it?
Yeah. Often a piece of advice that I give young scientists, not just graduate students, but also people starting out in faculty careers, that one of the things that you're going to need the most is a group of people that you can trust to be pretty real with about this career, because it's not always perfect and you're not going to want to hold that inside. And so you're going to need a network of people that you can go to who will be cheerleaders for you when things are going really well. You definitely need those people, but you also need people who will listen to you when things are not going well and help you problem solve. And I'm really lucky that I have those people, and I've worked hard at developing those networks. And so I would encourage other scientists to do the same.
Absolutely. Well, Tessa, thanks so much for sharing some of these challenges that you face in your own career. But we don't just want to talk about the difficult times in your science career. I do want to chat next about a success story. I think there are so many different types of successes in science. So is there a story that you can share of one of these huge moments that really meant a lot, or even just a small victory?
I will go back to something that you mentioned at the beginning of the show, which is that about a year ago, I was awarded a Presidential Early Career Award for scientists and engineers.
Congratulations.
Thank you, by President Obama. And the entire process and really the whole season of spring of last year was extremely exhilarating and definitely felt like one of those moments that you just referred to. But part of that is that I was invited to come to D.C. and go to the White House and meet the president, along with the 100 other people who were awarded this on the same day. And there was several days of receptions and award ceremonies and various things that happened. And one of the best parts of that is that I got to bring my parents with me to much of that. They didn't get to come to the White House with me, but they got to go to all of the other events. And it felt really fitting, actually, that the people who had encouraged me to pursue my scientific interests at a very young age were sitting right next to me when these amazing events were happening for me last year. And so it will be hard to beat that. That will be a high point in my career for a very long time.
Now, are your parents scientists themselves?
No, they're not.
Interesting.
They're just great people who encouraged that in me.
I love that. So can you tell us what it was like going to the White House and meeting the president?
It was amazing. I mean, the White House looks exactly like what you see on TV and in the movies. So that
the beautiful, pristine pictures.
It's beautiful. Yes, it's beautiful. And the group of us, we spent a lot of time just we got a little tour before meeting the president. And we spent a lot of time just admiring how beautiful and important that day felt, I think, for all of us. And meeting the president was incredibly inspiring. He was very funny and very gracious and a wonderful host and shared a few words with us. And then we did this very long receiving line so that he could shake each of our hands and we could each say a few words to him. And mostly I just felt tremendously grateful for what a supporter of science he is. And it was very genuine. I think he's a real fan of scientists. So it felt like a real celebration, both for him and for us.
Oh, that is awesome. And congratulations again, Tessa, on the winning of this very prestigious award. And it sounds like the wonderful, well-deserved fanfare that came along with it.
Thank you.
Absolutely. And we've talked about a lot of different aspects of your career in science, the ups, the downs, the career paths. And for me, it's really important to have that opportunity to escape from science sometimes. For some people, it's going out for a run. For some people, it's picking up a book. I'm always on the lookout for book recommendations, Tessa. So I'm going to bug you for one today. Is there a book that you've read and really enjoyed that you can recommend for me and our listeners, whether it's a science book or a non-science book?
Yes, I have a great one. It is called Lab Girl by Hope Gerens. And it's kind of a science book because she's an amazing scientist, but it's also a book about life and life as a scientist. And it's also a book about plants. And you will fall in love with plants if you aren't already in love with them. You will end this book wanting to spend your days planting trees. Mm-hmm. So it's an amazing read, and I think for people who want to see the ups and downs of science, it is real and raw and inspiring. And also, like I said, the parts that explore sort of the world of plants are also equally inspiring and exciting.
Yeah, I think very well written. I recommend this book as well, listeners. So.
I had a feeling that would be the case, but it's a great one.
Yeah, I loved it. It was fantastic. So I will put it out on our website for our listeners to find if they're in search of their next great read. And we talked about your work a little bit and some of the opportunities you've had to travel to different places as part of your career. And I think, Tessa, this is one of the wonderful aspects of a career in science, the opportunity to go to all these different places, to share your research, to work with others. So can you think back now to all the places that science has taken you and tell us about your favorite?
Evidently, I'm not very good at narrowing things down to only one thing.
That's okay.
I could easily give you a list of 10 places that I loved traveling to. I do think one of the things I love about being a scientist is traveling and seeing the world. So I will pick one, but I'm not sure it's my favorite, but it's just a great one, which is that shortly after I finished graduate school, I was a postdoc, and I got to go on a research cruise that left from Bergen, Norway. And we sailed for close to 3 weeks and came into Reykjavik, Iceland. And we were studying a really amazing event in the fossil record. So we were taking sediment cores, which are like giant tubes of sediment from the bottom of the ocean. So by day, we were spending all of this time looking at sediments. Actually, we did this 24 hours a day, so I can't remember what shift I was on, by day or by night.
Oh, wow.
I worked a lot on this really interesting time period in Earth's history that we were studying. But one of the things I really remember about the cruise is that I would spend my shift looking at the science, which was really fascinating. And then I would go down and lay down in my bunk and try to go to sleep. And I could hear whales outside of the ship.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it was amazing. And I remember thinking to myself, literally my job is to be on a boat studying amazing events in Earth's history, and I'm surrounded by whales in my off time. So that was pretty amazing. And I do think that there are moments of being an oceanographer that really feel like that. You end up with this very deep connection of sort of how the ocean works. And I feel very privileged that that's my job.
Definitely. Well, these research cruises sound like a really great adventure, being out there, being able to collect the data, and also being that close to nature, the ocean. But have you had any, mishaps or run-ins with storms or any problems on any of these cruises? Because you are kind of in the middle of nowhere in some cases.
Oh, sure. There are mishaps and run-ins with storms on all of them.
Yeah.
Yes, that is absolutely also a part of being an oceanographer. Losing things at sea or having horrible sea conditions where the entire boat is sick and no one can come out of their cabins. All of those things have happened to me as well. I don't look back on those things so much.
Right. Let those fall away in your memory.
I try to not think back on all the times I've been seasick, for example, and instead I think about the whales.
Gotcha. So how do you prepare your students, or if you travel with students, for the types of conditions you may encounter?
Interesting question. Many of them have had some sort of experience like that before they come to me. But I would say most of the students who come into my research group actually have a strong desire to do field work. And I would say all of them end up doing field work, even if it's not critical for their research. Oftentimes students end up volunteering to go help other people with research. So many of my students do field work of different types. A lot of them right now are doing very nearshore coastal work, so they're snorkeling or scuba diving off of small boats. But I also have students who have gone out on multi-day or many-week trips along the California coast, and I think they have experienced all of those things that I just described, terrible weather and equipment failures. I think that's just part of being a scientist, and I guess that's what I meant when I referred earlier to how important it was for me as an undergraduate to see that whole spectrum of science, that science is hard days and good days and failure and recovery and big discoveries, but also a lot of incremental work. And I try really hard when I'm mentoring undergraduates to help them see all of those different pieces too, because being a scientist means a lot of different things.
Definitely. And I think it's funny when people ask, what's your average day like? There's no average day, right?
There is no average day.
Wonderful. It's been great to hear more about your lab, your research group, as we've gone through our conversation. And I think some of the people that you get to work with as a scientist are just phenomenal. These are some of the funniest, most creative, most interesting people I've met. And I think there are some stereotypes about what scientists are like. And I love to break those on our show because I think there are so many different people who find careers in science. So do you have a story of your own, Tessa, that you can share of maybe quirky traditions that you've developed or experienced in different laboratories, or just some fun or funny memories you've shared with colleagues?
The quirky traditions I'm thinking of in my lab right now, I'm not sure that people would want me to talk about publicly.
That's fair.
They're funny enough that they might be embarrassed. But no, I'll backtrack on that a little bit and say that I have an amazing lab group of very funny, very supportive people. And we spend a lot of time together, and a lot of that is science, and some of it is social. Most of both of those things are super fun. But we've started a tradition of a lab retreat where we actually all go away together for one weekend during the summer. We did this for the first time last summer, and we're starting to plan it again for this summer. And it was just 100% fun. So we cooked together and we laughed together and we played games and we went hiking, and we have musicians in the group. And so there's a tremendous amount of variety of who scientists are. I completely agree with you. And they're quirky, but they're also funny and normal and do all the normal things that everybody else does too.
Right.
So it's pretty great to have a group of people work together who would actually choose to spend the weekend together just having fun. I think that's pretty awesome and worth celebrating. So we will keep that up.
Absolutely. So where's the destination of your next retreat?
Oh, we haven't picked, actually. I mean, it will be somewhere in Northern California because we don't want to spend a lot of time traveling anywhere. Mm-hmm. But we'll pick a rental house somewhere in Northern California that gets people away from the lab and their computers so we can just sort of be together and laugh for the weekend.
Absolutely. Now, you mentioned there's some musicians in your group. Are you a musician yourself?
Well, I'm not sure I can call myself that. Yeah. I played music as a child. Mm-hmm. I played both piano and clarinet, and both of my kids are playing piano, and one of my kids is playing trombone. So I definitely encourage their musical abilities, and I enjoy being able to help them on the piano because I still remember enough piano that I can help them. And I really, really, really enjoy listening to music. So there's almost always music playing in our house and in my office. But I don't think I'm terribly musically talented.
I think you don't have to be talented to have fun at it. I'm still like scratching away at my violin years later. So.
Cheers to that.
Well, fantastic to hear more about your lab and how you guys have fun together. And I think we've talked about some of the great work that you've done over the years with your different laboratory groups that you've worked with. And I think answering some of these big questions is why it's so exciting to be in the field of science. But there's a lot of questions that we're not able to tackle because the scope is too big. We don't have the funding. We don't have the resources. It's not even feasible yet. But I'm curious, Tessa, if I gave you everything you needed, funding, staff, technology, feasibility, all the time in the world, what is the one question that you are most interested in answering?
I already told you I'm really bad at these one things.
I know. If there's two, that's okay.
But I have a list. Okay, so this is a really hard question for me because I think one of the things that happens to you as a scientist is you generate far more ideas than you can ever do or ever get funding to do. So I always have lists of things in my head that I would love to do. One of the things I would love to do that is not so much about a single question, but one of the problems we're encountering with ocean acidification, this chemical change that's happening in the ocean, is that because of limitations in technology and the cost of technology, we actually have very few people with instruments in the water tracking how that process is happening. And it turns out it's very important to not just track this process from one place on the globe because there's a lot of variability in the ocean. The ocean is really dynamic and has a lot of different processes going on within it. For example, along a coastline, you can imagine that the ocean is sometimes interacting with rivers or bays and other times not.
Sure.
And so you have places along the coastline where the chemistry of the ocean is vastly different than it is from right around the corner. So there's sort of these neighborhoods along the coast, right? And we don't have any ability right now to study ocean acidification at a neighborhood level. And I would really like to see us instrument the coast to be able to actually understand how this problem is proceeding. And we could learn things from that, like that there are certain places along the coast that are more impacted than others. And that might tell us some things about organisms to study or how to restore environments or how to take a species that's particularly impacted by this problem and maybe help it. But we're stuck. We can't actually answer those questions because we don't have that neighborhood level of information about ocean acidification.
Very interesting. Well, I think this is a great question. I think you mentioned there was maybe at least one other one you wanted to talk about.
Yeah. So the other thing, again, this is limitations due to both technology and money. It's very hard for us to understand how climate change and ocean acidification are going to impact the deep sea because we're really limited in our ability to get to the deep sea. Mm-hmm. We're very lucky, actually, in this day and age. There's several research expeditions that go out every year that are actually live streaming footage from the deep sea. So I can sit in my office and watch footage from somewhere on the other side of the globe of what the deep sea looks like and what species are there and things like that. But again, it's very hard for us to say, is change occurring in these environments? Are there species that we haven't even yet discovered that might face extinction because the deep sea is going to change due to climate change? There's so many unanswered questions about the deep sea and how it will be susceptible to climate change and ocean acidification. So if I had unlimited funds, I would open up access to the deep sea to the scientific community so that we could learn about it really fast before it starts to change.
Fantastic question, though. Tessa, I'm curious now, talking about the deep sea, have you had an opportunity to go down there on one of these missions, or is this something that you aspire to do someday?
I've done a fair amount of work where I'm the person on the ship looking at a panel of computer screens and video cameras, and we're actually using remotely operated submersibles to explore the deep sea.
Okay.
So I have not been in a submersible myself. I would love to, but I'm also very lucky in that I've been able to do a lot of work that was possible because we had these sort of robots that we could deploy to the deep sea and do a lot of observations, but also sampling in the deep sea while we were sitting on shore. So I feel very lucky. The technological advances have been huge in opening up access to the deep sea, but we need more of that. We know less about the deep sea than we do about the surface of other planets. We actually know our own moon better than we do about the deep sea.
Well, I think I'm with you there. I think my claustrophobia would keep me on the deck of the ship rather than going down there.
Well, there you go. So you could be on one of these cruises with the robots. You would do well.
Yeah, we could hang out and watch the robots explore.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, Tessa, thanks so much for dreaming big with us today and chatting about some of these big questions in your field that remain unanswered. And I think we've talked about your career throughout our conversation today. And I think there have been some big influences of people that you've worked with along the way, mentors, teachers. And I think these people can be great sources of advice. So is there a piece of advice that you've received that you want to share with our listeners today that really helped you?
I think I've had mentors say to me, stay true to yourself in this and listen to that inner voice, which sometimes can get really crowded out by a lot of the things actually that we talked about on this call. So those mentors have been really valuable for me because sometimes I would go to them and say, I'm not sure I can do this, or I'm not sure I'm up for this. And those mentors sometimes have the clarity to say, think back at sort of who you are and what your goal is and where you're headed and stay true to that. And I think that's really powerful. So I guess the lesson in that is to listen to those people who can be beacons for you.
I love it. Well said. Now, is there any other last piece of advice, Tessa, you want to leave our listeners with, or a last note of inspiration that you want to end our conversation on today?
I think I would go back to some things that we talked about earlier in the call, that what really fundamentally drives me is curiosity about how the world works, and in my case, about how the ocean works. And so I would encourage people who are contemplating becoming a scientist to stay true to that, stay true to the curiosity, stay true to the part of you that wants to learn more about the Earth or other planets, if that's the case, or how the world works. We need as many people asking and answering questions and telling other people what they're discovering. We need as many people as possible doing that.
I absolutely agree. And I think that curiosity is what gets you through some of these tough times that we talked about, this need to know the answer to these questions.
I agree.
Wonderful. Well, thanks so much for sharing your advice and your insights with us today, Tessa. Can you tell our listeners where they can go if they want to learn more about you and your work?
Sure. I have a couple of ways they can find me. So I have a website, and the website address is Hill, like my last name, hillbiogeochemistry.squarespace.com. So it's like one big word, hillbiogeochemistry.squarespace.com. I'm also on Twitter, and I'm very easy to find on there because I think my Twitter handle is at Tessa M. Hill, but with underscores in between those words. So at Tessa_M_Hill. And my lab also has a public Facebook page where we post things that are going on in the lab, but also sort of more generally, we post things that are happening in the ocean or climate change space that we want the public to hear about. So you can find us on Facebook if you just search for Ocean Climate Lab -UC Davis. You will locate us and you will see the kinds of things that we're up to, but also more broadly information about climate change and how it's impacting the ocean.
Fantastic. Well, Tessa, thanks so much for sharing these resources with our listeners. Listeners, definitely check out the website, check out the Facebook page, and follow Tessa on Twitter. And Tessa, thanks so much again for joining us today and sharing a piece of your story.
Thank you so much. This has been a really fun conversation.
Well, it was a pleasure to chat with you as well. Listeners, thanks for joining us today. We'll see you next time on another episode of People Behind the Science. Your voyage to explore the lives of today's exceptional scientists has just begun. You can find everything we talked about today, including our guests' favorite books, biographies, photos, and more, when you visit us at www.peoplebehindthescience.com. I look forward to chatting with you next time on People Behind the Science.